Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Tony Blair has waded into the Labour leadership debate, accusing Keir Starmer, Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting of putting the party's future at risk. Reform are facing a threat from their right flank in the form of Rupert Lowe's Restore Britain party, which is dragging them even further to the right, which is worrying. And major news in China. The hukou system is being dismantled. Now, you might know what that means. Might not know what that means, but we'll be explaining it all at the end of the show. Incredibly interesting. I'm joined tonight by Aaron Bastani. I should say a brief apology that we're starting half an hour late today. There is a good reason, though, which is that Aaron Bastani was interviewing Karen Howe, and it went on a little bit longer than usual because she's just so interesting.
She's so interesting. We started slightly late, not because of Karen, I should add. The weather is obviously complicating train times, my end, and all these things. But we are here, Michael. The show will not be abbreviated as a result, but it's a late start. So my apologies.
Oh, you sound almost exhausted by the heat in that interview. We're going to have to perk you up for the rest of this show.
That's it, Michael. But when we go to one of the videos, maybe with Blair talking nonsense.
I'm going to pass you some Pro Plus.
Pro Plus, pour an espresso.
Exactly. I want the real energetic Bastani.
Go on, let's do it.
Before we get into the show tonight, we just wanted to thank everyone who has signed up to become a regular supporter over the past couple of weeks. And we have huge plans for growth over the next few months. And with that strengthened supporter base, we can do so much more, including getting an air-conditioned studio. So if you like what we do, why not sign up from £1 per month today? You may know that here on YouTube, about 30% of each donation goes straight to Google. So instead, head over to our website, novara.media/support. That link is in the description, and you can donate anything you can afford per month. Aaron, you want to come in?
I do. I've been told by our crack fundraising team that it's not implausible. It's not implausible that we get 5,000 new supporters.
Incredible.
It's not implausible. Would you like to be one of those 5,000? Michael Walker feeding the 5,000 with his takes, news, and current affairs coverage. Get on board with those proverbial fishes and loaves from just £1 a month.
We would absolutely love that. Huge plans for this organisation, and the more supporters we get, the more ambitious we can become. Tony Blair's career since leaving Downing Street has been incredibly lucrative. He has a property empire reportedly worth £35 million. He's made big bucks advising US banks, and since 2016, he's exerted enormous global influence via the Tony Blair Institute, heavily funded by Larry Ellison, of course. However, when not cavorting with the world's hyper-elites, he has been keeping an eye on developments back home in Britain. And today he has published an almost 6,000-word essay on exactly what he thinks Britain's politicians are getting wrong. So the essay, which was published on X and the Tony Blair Institute website, warns that the Labour Party is playing with fire with its own future and with that of the country. Now, this is a reference to the party having a leadership election while in government, which he sees as especially a problem as, in his view, none of the leading candidates have set out any credible ideas. So he writes this: trying to force the Prime Minister out before we know what policy direction we're bringing in is not a serious way of conducting ourselves. And so far, though of course these are very early days, we have a fight between a modernising wing of the Labour Party appearing to advocate rejoining the EU and now equalising capital gains and income tax, something rejected by successive governments for good reason, and the alternative, which thinks the answer is moving even further left on taxes, spending and welfare, spun with a rehash of the far-left critique about nothing good coming out of the last 40 years of quote-unquote neoliberalism, which presumably includes the last Labour government. Now, among his recommendations, Blair suggests Labour's new workers' rights law and their higher minimum wage have been obstacles to growth and should be removed. He wants to prioritise cheap electricity over net zero and restart drilling for North Sea oil and gas. He also thinks we need welfare reform, including reducing access to disability benefits and ending the triple lock on pensions. And throughout, he supports the use of AI by the government. So lots of this is framed as we're about to have a technological revolution. So the government needs to get a grip and basically be much more pro-business. It's slightly difficult to follow that argument, if I'm honest. The essay has provoked strong reactions from across the political spectrum. Before we get to those, though, Blair laid out his arguments in a couple of interviews this morning. This is from the Today programme.
Hold on a second, people might say, look, Labour was elected on a promise of change. It got a vast majority on the basis of that promise. And here you are arguing that when Labour ministers came to office, they should have ripped up their promise to protect workers with more rights, to increase the minimum wage, to turn our energy supply green and clean. Blair comes along and says, no, forget all that. Now you're in office. That's a daft idea.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. But here's the problem. If this AI revolution is what I say it is, and if we need higher levels of growth as a country, which we obviously do, then even if you put these things in a manifesto, and let's be clear, I don't think Labour won the last election because people read the manifesto and said, this is what we want. I think people thought that Conservatives have behaved completely unacceptably, and to Keir Starmer's great credit, the Labour Party was an acceptable alternative. Now, when it came in, it saw the state of the inheritance. I think at that point, of course it would be difficult. Everything in politics is difficult. But if I'd been them, I'd say, look, all of these commitments, they may be very worthwhile. They may be proper commitments in easy times. But in these hard times, we've got to prioritise growth. We've got to prioritise support for the business sector. And this artificial intelligence revolution, we've got to grasp it, both its opportunities and its risks, with both hands. And so I think, yes, it would have been tough, but I think you could have explained to the country why it was necessary.
Aaron, I'm sure you were desperate for an intervention from Tony Blair, 5,600 words. What do you make of his interventions today?
I mean, it's just outrageous. If you walk down your nearest high street, talk to any small business, they might love Labour, they might hate Labour, they might think that the last 2 years have seen an upswing or a downturn. It doesn't really matter. None of them, I'm repeating, none of them are talking about how the government should focus more on AI. None of them. They'll be talking about how they want maybe less regulation. They maybe will talk about the minimum wage stuff, cheaper energy, I think cheaper rents, more law and order, more police. But by the way, these are, for the most part, things that Keir Starmer and his government have at least acknowledged, right? They've put more funding towards the police, for instance. They put more funding recently towards trading standards in the last couple of weeks. Not much, but some. So there's that. It just seems just very bizarre to look at Britain right now. We had in Wales, the top two parties in an election in Wales, where Labour have come first for 100 years, the top two parties applied Cymru reform, and Tony Blair's talking about AI. I mean, I feel like I'm going a bit mad, actually. It feels really surreal. The same in Scotland, the same in the Gorton-Denton by-election, right? The same now in Makerfield. It seems that Labour probably will win it, but Reform will do very well. Restore will probably keep their deposit. A new party now to the right of Reform could keep their deposit. And he's talking about AI. A few things on top of that. You know, he said that people didn't necessarily vote for Labour in the last general election. They just wanted to not vote for the Tories. Surely you could make the same point about his 2005 general election win when he won 9.5 million votes, which, by the way, was less votes than what Keir Starmer won in 2024 when he won 9.7 million votes.
That's probably because of a smaller population, right? I mean, he did win more votes in 90. Yeah, like as a percentage. It was more comfortable.
Yeah, it's the lowest. Of course, you're right. But to this day, it's the lowest number of votes that a government with a majority has ever won, right? So I think it's fair to say that the electorate was not enthusiastic about Blair in 2005. And I think some people would also say in 97, of course, when Labour won, there was the exact same phenomenon of the Tories had been exhausted, they were over, and that's his theory of change, right? You can only ever be a credible alternative to the Tories. The Tories screw up and then Labour come in. Labour can never have a vision of their own. And I think that's partly why the country's in such a mess.
I mean, he would say Labour had a vision, right? Because I suppose the argument...
In 97 or 2024?
In 97. So I think the argument he makes, which is correct, is that if you want to get elected as a government, you need a positive vision for the country. You need to explain what you want the country to be like. And you can't say, I want to win the next general election to keep out reform, which is what I think he feels like the contenders in the Labour leadership election are saying, that they don't have enough of a positive vision. Now, I don't think he's correct in many things.
What was his positive vision in 1997?
In 97, I think it was an idea that we can be pro-business, we'll be very pro-business, and we will redistribute the proceeds of growth to public services and alleviating poverty.
Yeah. And here's the thing, Michael. The economy was growing. The economy in this sense, until 2024, hadn't really grown for 16 years. Whereas in 1997, you're coming out of a productivity boom in the early 1990s. Ken Clarke runs 2 budget surpluses. government borrowing is actually quite expensive at that point. But regardless, in terms of the business cycle, you're coming out of this big upswing because of the end of the Cold War, cheap consumer durables coming from China, globalization 2.0 really kicking off. So you can have that platform. And politically it worked. I think actually he did sweet FA given the sort of hand he was dealt. But you can have that platform, pro-business, and a little bit of social democracy tacked on when you have growth. The problem for Starmer, and this is where I think he's really uncharitable to Labour, and I'm not a fan of Starmer, right? But the conditions are really hard right now to govern with any consent and to solve the problems and to build a broad coalition. It's really hard. It can be done. People in other countries have done that, but it's not like it was in 1997. In 1997, people were like, okay, Thatcher, she did some things. They weren't all good. Keep some of them. Get rid of some of them. Be slightly more socially fair. Be slightly more egalitarian. Make us feel good and optimistic about the future. It's so much harder in 2024. So much harder. The country's so much more polarized. Geopolitically, the situation is so much more different. We haven't got North Sea oil anymore. The demographics are very different. Michael, here's an amazing statistic. And people really need to bear this in mind. This is how different the country was when Tony Blair was the PM. In 2000, briefly, Vodafone was one of the 10 largest companies in the world.
Wow.
For one quarter. It was bigger than Intel, Vodafone. And that tells you something about how strange the British economy looked for a brief moment. We're not there anymore, right?
Although he would try and claim some credit for that, right? In the interviews today, he was saying, when I was leader, there was all this growth, business was happy, everyone was happy, public services were good. Do you think, it's ridiculous for him to claim that as his own achievements, and it was just that he inherited a good set of cards or good hand?
Well, he inherited a good hand in one respect, which is the global business cycle was very healthy everywhere in the 1990s and early 2000s. He had North Sea oil, right? This country was a net energy exporter, I think, for the first couple of years of his premiership at least. We're in a quite different situation now. He did put money into various public services really after 2002-3. But the idea that, Blair accomplished so much. Michael, he had Goldilocks economic conditions, growth, like I say, very low debt to GDP, about 25% debt to GDP, very low unemployment when he comes in, a productivity boom across Europe. You've got rising global incomes, rising global productivity, a golden age. And, if somebody had governed differently, it might have been slightly better or slightly worse. But broadly speaking, those are the parameters. What does Britain have to show for that? If you look at, for instance, the golden age, say from 45 to the late 60s, you can look at, okay, the NHS, lots of housing stock. You might not like it, those council flats, but you can visibly see what happened. Or if you look at Spain, their golden age, really until the late 2000s, and a bit after that, they built a ton of high-speed rail. Or France in the 80s, when they were doing really well economically, a ton of high-speed rail, nuclear power stations, real strategic technological autonomy. What does Britain have to show for that golden era economically? I don't think it's very much. Norway with North Sea oil, compare what they did with it to what we did with it. Blair was part of that, although of course it's primarily Margaret Thatcher and John Major. So I think he actually wasted a huge historical opportunity for this country. I think, again, more so Thatcher and Major, but he was part of that as well. And there just seems to be no reflection from him. And he talks about, I want to start a conversation. Well, a conversation works both ways. So I'm saying to you, Tony Blair, get off the Times radio, get off BBC Radio 4, go and talk to people who strongly disagree with you. Come on Novara Media. You probably won't do that. It's just a YouTube channel, 1.2 million subscribers. But go and talk to people who disagree with you and have a robust critique of what you're saying. He doesn't do that. He doesn't want a conversation, Michael. He doesn't want a conversation. He wants to be proven right. And any Labour Party which succeeds while deviating from his kind of diktat and his worldview and his theory of change will upset him. And he has a very sort of motivated set of reasoning that means he wants it to fail. He wants Labour to fail if it deviates from what he thinks it has to do, because that undermines his sense of self-worth. Does that make sense?
No, totally. I mean, I think in terms of the legacies he left, I think there are some public services which undoubtedly did improve under New Labour. The NHS, absolutely. Education, absolutely.
In London, yes.
I think
schools in London,
educational results improved.
But in
everywhere.
London,
but in inner London is where it was transformative. Complete transformation. But it is the fact that the economic legacy is very, very minimal. Right, so that boom was partly funded by the boom in global finance, which we were sort of creaming off the top because it was centered in the City of London. So one idea was just tax the City of London to fund social services everywhere. Of course, once the financial crisis comes, that model doesn't work anymore. So Tony Blair can't just say, well, I did this model, it worked. Why can't you do that again? Well, because it's impossible now. One of the other reasons why we had a big boom was a housing boom. Now, what happens is a housing boom, you encourage it, you deregulate finance, and people's house prices go up, and that makes them feel richer. And so they spend more money, they have confidence, they love the government because their house has tripled in price. But then you reach a point whereby no one else can afford this anymore, and you're stuck there. So now everyone's like, why have we got this stagnation? Well, the house prices can't go up anymore because they reach their limit. They also can't come down because then there'll be a huge revolt by the electorate. So you're stuck in a situation where builders have spent loads of money on land, so they'll only build a house if it goes at the going rate, like £1 million for a 2 up, 2 down in London. But no one can afford to buy it at that. So I think the deregulation that they did of the housing market, I mean, mainly, the biggest deregulations were under Margaret Thatcher. But if you look at when house prices rocketed, it was actually from 1997 onwards. And that has left us with a really, really terrible legacy because they weren't building at the same time.
Can I say one thing? Statistics on this. And again, for younger people, you might not think there's that much to it. I think because buy-to-let mortgage products are introduced actually, I think, slightly before Blair. But the ratio at which they increased in terms of their adoption, I think, was 35 times. Right, so I think they're coming 95 with major, I think. But basically, this idea of buy-to-let, the idea that you'd have a mortgage product that you can buy a property with, then rent it out, and increasingly we see HMOs, that's a Blair thing. House prices quadrupled. The median house price, the average house price, quadrupled between 1997 and 2007. They quadrupled. Now imagine you're a homeowner and you're remortgaging every 2 years, and the value's just going up and up and up, and interest rates are quite low. That was what was driving consumer confidence. Of course it was driving consumer confidence. But again, nobody says this to him. They say, like, Tony, you had this incredible, unique set of circumstances which built political consent and made people feel good.
And partly doomed the guys after you as well, right?
100%, right?
Because you can only have a housing boom once.
Yeah.
Because it can't go up anymore because no one, it has reached the maximum it can ever be.
But the crazy thing is we had a housing boom without building houses. It's the worst kind of boom to have. Yeah. At least with the AI boom, you're building the data centers. You might not like the data centers, but they're building something. With the railway boom, a speculative boom in the 19th century with railroads in the United States, they still built the railroads. We weren't building houses. We had as many houses, just they were 4 times more valuable than they were before. But there is just such a lack of self-criticism from this man, which I get. Lots of us can't do that. But surely Nick Robinson could say that, right?
Yeah, I mean, he did challenge him on a couple of things.
But not on the big stuff, on his legacy.
Not on the big stuff, yeah.
Michael, they can't. They can't challenge him on his legacy because the entirety, British politics is based upon, common sense of British politics is based on basically 2 moments, 1979 and 1997. And if you challenge those fundamentals, all of a sudden the map no longer makes sense. Because the consensus by the whole Westminster elite has been that 1979 broadly had to happen. We had to smash the unions. We had to privatise. We had to deregulate. We had to do that. You might not like it. It could have been done slightly better or slightly worse, but we had to do it. And 1997, Labour had to accept all of that. They had to accept, the hegemony of finance. And they had to continue that legacy of outsourcing and privatisation. Because, maybe actually the country could have been better. There were opportunities for us to make better choices. And I don't think people want to do that. They're not prepared to do that because many of them were complicit in that. They were cheering it on. Or they supported it. I'm not trying to moralise here. Maybe if we were political journalists in 1997, we'd probably do the same thing. We'd have a giant house in London that was doubling in value every few years. This is fantastic. This guy's a genius. But it turns out, like you said, it's a one-off, and now we're paying the price.
Yeah. The point about us not building even in the boom is, so China is an example I often use sort of in the sort of YIMBY debate, right? Because they had a housing boom which was based on credit and the fact that people's pensions aren't very good, so everyone threw their money into housing. So they had a massive housing bubble, and it has caused a big sort of economic challenge for the government. That's why they've tried to pop it, because it was absorbing too much overall investment. But what they also had was shed loads of building. So they had a housing boom and building. Now they've got, in a way, if you're a property owner, too many buildings, and that's pushing the prices down. But guess who it's really good for? Renters. Like, their boom built so much that rent is now really cheap in China, even if they've got a bit of a sort of problem in terms of the finances, because now people's savings are in an asset whose value is declining. But at least you get the stuff, right? We had the worst of both worlds. We had the housing boom without any extra housing. You mentioned there 1979. That was a theme, or not 1979 per se, but the idea that we've had 40 years of neoliberalism, about which Tony Blair took issue with. So in the essay, and then in his sort of round of interviews this morning, he responded to what he considered a swipe from Andy Burnham, who said in a recent video that Britain had been going in the wrong direction for the past 40 years.
I just think when you look at the analysis, for example, and by the way, I hope Andy wins Makerfield. I think he's a great guy. I want to see him in Parliament. But, when he does this thing about 40 years of, wasted, I don't know what it is. We've been going the wrong
40
direction.
40 years of neoliberalism,
right.
He says.
Okay. So, we're 2026. Let's go back to 1986. Well, we assume he doesn't mean the first 7 years of Margaret Thatcher, right? So back to the 70s. Okay. And nothing good happened in that period of Thatcher with the business community or New Labour. But by the way, when I was in office, we had a strong economy. We had improving public services. We had improving results in education. We reduced poverty, both for pensioners and for children. We were a progressive government. We weren't a neoliberal government. We doubled the spending on the health service, for heaven's sake, and introduced the minimum wage.
So Andy Burnham has now hit back at Tony Blair. So he said this to The Observer today. So it sounds like it was sort of an interview which was done on the campaign trail. So Burnham says, Tony Blair doesn't mention inequality once. If you don't get how that's driving politics now, if you are not rooting your analysis in the fact that people are unable to live and that things that were taken for granted are no longer affordable, then you are not understanding what's going on. Blair criticizes my phrase about 40 years of neoliberalism, but the last 40 years has given us wide inequality. That's what's responsible for the abandonment of the centre. People don't think the centre has delivered for them in terms of their lives. Therefore, they've gone further to the extremes. Aaron, your thoughts?
That's a pretty good assessment, isn't it? And also, what was public debt in 1986? What was it? I think we can find out. It's pretty damn low. Or if we go back to the 70s? What, the 70s? Yeah, when this country had its own ability to send satellites into space, or when we had rising real incomes, or when we were building homes, or when we had full employment, or when we were a major automotive and steel producer. So British Leyland was a disaster. Well, you know what? There's no car companies now. Are you happy? Okay, it was a disaster. It could have been managed better. It could have become a better company. Maybe it could have been turned around. Also really important to say with regards to deindustrialization, more of it happened under Blair than Thatcher. In terms of a percentage of the economy going over to industry, industrial production as a percentage of GDP, it was worse under Blair than with Thatcher. And I do genuinely believe this, Michael. In 25, 30 years' time, people will look at Thatcher and Blair as a disaster for this country. I genuinely believe that. And I think people on the right and the left will both say that. Now, it doesn't mean nothing good happened. Some good things have happened. If you look at, and I'm not a huge fan of the Docklands, right? I'm not a huge fan of, high finance. But I think most people would struggle to look at the Docklands today, just physically look at the infrastructure that's there and say, you know what, actually, no, in the early 1980s when Bob Hoskins was down there, the long Good Friday, it was better. I don't think that's true. I think London's a much nicer city. The fabric of it is much nicer now than it was 40 years ago, 100%. Do I think the country is moving in a good direction? No. Do I think it's moving in a positive direction in a way that it was in the 70s? No, not really. I think there's much lower social capital. I think people are less happy. I think in many ways we're a less innovative society. Angus Hansen, really amazing statistic. In 1984, there were more tech companies on the FTSE 100 than there are now in terms of dealing with high technology. We were a world leader in things like telecommunications with BT and Marconi in the 80s. We aren't anymore. So, even as recently as 2004, 5, a company like Marconi they would have built 5G. They would have been the Huawei, maybe. Probably not, right, because it's a very competitive market. But Marconi was a bigger player in 5G than Huawei was. We let Marconi die. These were British companies doing this kind of stuff in these kinds of industries. And other countries made choices not to let those companies die or to even give them access to cheap finance like the Chinese did. We've made over the last 40, 50 years in this country lots of bad decisions. I think mostly as a result of the Thatcherite Revolution, but not just because of the Thatcherite Revolution. I would say actually many of Blair's constitutional reforms as well. I don't really understand why we have a Supreme Court, personally. I think if you're going to do devolution, you have to do it for the whole country and have some kind of pattern the fact you've got devolution for Wales and Scotland, but not England, large bits of England, alongside the inequality, alongside the regional inequality, I can see why loads of people in England are really, really unhappy and dissatisfied and feel politically left out. I mean, that was obvious. They are. So we've just got so much wrong. And the fact that he can't just say that, he can't just say this country's got a lot wrong in the last 40 years. It has.
Yeah, because does he not like anything about it? But like, it's such a low bar to set yourself, isn't it, for Tony Blair? Did he not like anything that we did over the past 13 years? Like, Andy Burnham isn't exactly saying he didn't like anything he did over the past 13 years. He's just saying that the overall narrative was a problematic one, I suppose.
And also, I think the best takeaway is it's a much less rosy picture than we're told by the political media elite and people like you, right? Which I think most people would say that. Most people would say that. And that is not an outlandish kind of thing to say.
I think the issue with the 70s, so the 70s incomes weren't obviously higher because we've had lots of growth since then, but growth was higher. So people would have felt that their lives were improving more. In part, people just think that growth was faster after the Second World War because we had manufacturing growth, and manufacturing has faster productivity gains than services. And also the public sector tends to have lower productivity gains than the private sector, mainly because so much of the public sector is sort of person-to-person services where it's hard to get productivity growth. I suppose the challenge that Thatcher had of the 1970s that I think was appealing to people and that probably the left doesn't really want to go back to is a powerful trade union movement, which we want, but one which is very decentralized, disorganized. So any industry where the workers have leverage, they can go on strike, but there's no real coordination. So what you had in Sweden, say, in the 1970s, is you had a system where there was sort of economy-wide centralized wage bargaining by a centralized trade union movement. And what that meant is that the productive sectors of the economy, their workers were actually paid a little bit less than they would be paid in sort of a completely free market. And what that meant was that their exports were very competitive. So people working in the cutting edge car factories actually had slightly less pay than they would have otherwise had if you had a trade union system like our own, where each trade union is out for itself to get the most sort of benefits it can for its own workers and no one else. So I think at the end of the 70s, we could have said, let's get out of this by centralizing trade unions, as they do in the Nordic countries or Germany, for example, or destroy them. And obviously Margaret Thatcher went down the destroy them line.
Yeah. I think if we'd done that and we'd been more judicious with our use of the resources from North Sea oil, this country would be so much wealthier, more productive, more innovative, so much better. This is what I mean. We made so many bad choices, and it's not all the right. I'm not saying that. The left's made some bad choices too. I think that vision of Labour conflict in the 70s was really, really problematic. I mean, it had huge downsides, and you don't need to want to go back to that. By the way, also, I would want more of an emphasis on the ownership of production rather than this real hard conflict between labour and capital, which is always going to exist. But the Meidner plan, for instance, to me, is far more radical and interesting, where actually workers get to own equity in some of the companies they work at, rather than this kind of conflict, which, like you say, in industries which aren't very profitable and are really struggling on a global market, like British automotive manufacturing was in the 70s. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster, right?
I had a teacher in political economy at LSE who said the labour movement should have accepted In Place of Strife by Barbara Castle, which was sort of to say, let's have a less conflictual, more centralised system of labour relations, but they kind of rejected it because it was undermining the power of the individual trade unions to some degree, which I thought was somewhat convincing. Let's have another look at Tony Blair this morning. So one of his biggest targets in the essay was Ed Miliband, who many people expect to have more influence if we do get an Andy Burnham government. So there's talk of him becoming Chancellor, although I think that's very much still up in the air. Anyway, this is what Tony Blair said to the News Agents podcast about Ed Miliband's key policy, which is the move to net zero.
And when it comes to net zero, I'm not a climate denier and I'm not against clean energy. Great, you should have more clean energy. But around the world today, countries, including the three biggest emitters in the world, China, America, India, account for over 50% of emissions. They're all going after clean, cheap energy and electrification. So if we're going to pursue clean energy and spend a lot of money doing it, there's got to be a pretty good reason, and there isn't one.
Well, Ed Miliband, I'm sure, would turn around and say, well, hang on, we want to be leading the world in clean energy? Well, you wince as I say that.
But look, Xi Jinping's not sitting there in Beijing saying, I wonder what Ed Miliband thinks of our look, it's in the end, of course, renewable energy is going to be the future long term. But by the way, with artificial intelligence, you may well get developments in nuclear fusion. You'll get developments in battery storage. There's a whole new world that will come down the track at us. But right now, our energy costs are really high. They're imposing costs on business. We've got this artificial intelligence revolution that's going to use more and more energy. We need more electricity if we're going to go for electric cars, which again, we should do. And therefore, all I'm saying is, the lens through which you judge policy should be cheap energy and electrification, because that's the way the rest of the world's doing it. And it's a sort of quixotic fantasy to think that because Britain's decided it's going with, by the way, under 1% of global emissions, is going to go down a different path at huge expense. It's quixotic to think that the rest of the world's going to follow that. It's not.
No, I think Ed Miliband should keep the net zero target. I think it's a good challenge to have. I think it would be a backward step if we sort of abandoned it. It would be a bad message to the world. But I think that's actually Tony Blair's strongest argument, potentially, because the best argument for us going to net zero, even though we're a very small sort of proportion of global emissions, is that people will say, oh, okay, Britain have done it, so we can do it. But people will look at Britain at the moment and think, well, Britain tried it and we don't want to be like Britain, right? People want to be like China because they look at China and they say, oh, they've had this amazing growth and they're rolling out solar and they're rolling out wind and electricity is really cheap. Like, that's an example people want to follow. And it is potentially a danger that our path to net zero, obviously switching from coal to gas was very easy. Building loads of new renewables was brilliant and very easy. It is trying to get the majority of your grid on renewables with current technology that does make electricity more expensive because you need to increase capacity on the grid because it is intermittent. That does make electricity a bit more expensive than it otherwise would be. And obviously not going to the North Sea makes it a bit more expensive than it otherwise would be. So I do think there is an argument to say the focus should be on renewables and electrification and not worry too much on current technologies getting down as close to zero as possible, given that technology is going to vastly improve in the future. But at the same time, obviously, I think the government made a progressive commitment, which in the face of what climate science is telling us about the climate is worth the money, even if it is making things a bit more expensive. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're right that it's the strongest part of what he's saying, not that I agree with it. I do think that the priority should be on cheap energy and electrification. I agree, okay? But here's the thing, Michael, it's very evasive, isn't it? Because he's saying what we're doing right now, and by the way, he's saying that we're the only country adopting this strategy, which is just not true, right? Aiming for net zero by a certain date is actually kind of, I thought that was the point of the Paris Treaty, but whatever. I
think ours are quite ambitious.
Yeah, ours are very ambitious. I think there are some other countries actually even more ambitious, quite small places. But anyway, I mean, we're not unique in this strategy of saying, let's just get to zero CO2 emissions by this date. That's quite a common thing, although we are being ambitious, fine. If he said, look, we need to electrify rail in this country, we should electrify all the buses, but we should drill for oil and gas in the North Sea. I think that those are the trade-offs, and I think that's a better way to do it. I think a lot of people, including me, would say that's really interesting. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of GDP? What does it mean in terms of growth? What does it mean in terms of CO2 emissions? Because, by the way, I think if you electrify all the rail and all the buses, I think it's about 3-4% of CO2 emissions fall. But that's going to cost you about £45 billion, right? That's the bit he doesn't say. So he just talks about the costs of what we're doing at the moment, which are big, and actually maybe that's not a rational set of choices to make. And then he says, well, we should be going for cheap energy and electrification. Electrification is going to cost lots of money. Electrifying every taxi in this country. Imagine all the taxis aren't just electric vehicles, but you also need the charging points for them. You're talking, I think I saw a number about 10 to 15, probably £15 billion, which I think we should do, right? I think we should have a target for that sort of stuff. I think we should electrify rail. I think we should electrify buses. I think we should be encouraging more people to use those modes of transport and reduce car journeys. And if you do all that together, I think a 25% reduction in car journeys and electrifying public transport, you're looking at 8-9% fall in CO2 emissions. Wow. But that's going to cost you about £60 billion, right? I think it's worth it. But he doesn't say that. So it's kind of like hand waving to criticize the Labour Party, to criticize government policy, and to make himself, feel good and seem like a wise man. But there are costs and benefits with all these choices. He doesn't acknowledge that. It just doesn't seem very serious to me.
Yeah. And I mean, I was thinking this today, because there is something on the surface of some of the things Blair and the Third Way or whatever said that I find appealing, which is to say, we don't have to just do the left-wing thing because we're the Labour Party. We can look at the evidence and we can say, this is the thing that's going to work, so let's do that. What works is what works. I mean, I think that was his sort of phrase when it came to public sector reform. It's a bit similar to Deng Xiaoping. It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or if it's a white cat, as long as it catches mice. And I do think that sort of being too tied to any one political ideology does sort of encourage confirmation bias, and I get a bit bored by just sort of listening to people who have exactly the same conclusion, whatever the problem, which is, if they're left-wing, it's more trade union rights and more state ownership, and if they're right-wing, it's lower taxes and more privatization. But I don't think Tony Blair actually really practices what he preaches, because I'm never surprised by anything he says.
No.
Right? He just, whatever the problem, he says we need more freedom for business, and that's basically it. We need more freedom for business and ID cards. And technology is brilliant. Like, where's the surprise? If he, in the middle of that essay, had gone on a big sort of detour discussing the importance of state capacity and recognizing how his time in government, while it did bring about improvements to public sector reform, continued the process of the erosion of state capacity. And that's one of the reasons why HS2 is so expensive. And so we need to invest in having significant, intelligent engineers building stuff. Because you can't say we're going to be like China and focus. We're going to be like China and not try and get to net zero super quick. We're going to focus on abundance.
Yeah.
And then not do any of the things that China is doing to get to abundance. Like, you're not just going to deregulate and get to abundance. Like, where's the surprise? Like Lee Kuan Yew, who I think sort of Tony Blair often cites as an inspiration, the leader of Singapore. I think they're probably friends. Like, he is very interesting as a pragmatic figure, because he said a very similar thing. He's like, I don't care about ideology. He didn't particularly like communism, but he was sort of...
He was an anti-communist, wasn't he?
He was an anti-communist, but he was also willing to kind of do whatever worked. And the main example is that all of the land in Singapore is nationalized. And there is a thing with Tony Blair. What is the surprising left-wing thing that he says? It's not there. It's like he's neither left nor right, but all his prescriptions are just like boilerplate center-right. Like, I need some proof that you're an original thinker. Surprise me somewhere.
Yeah. This is the crazy thing, right? The Soviet Union was more surprising in terms of its policy prescriptions in the 1920s than Blair is now. The economy had collapsed after the Russian Civil War, and Bukharin and Stalin say, you know what? Everything we've said is rubbish. We're going to do the NEP. We're going to actually form an alliance with the elite class in agriculture, the kulaks. We know how that ended. But anyway, the point is they did what had to be done, right? Tony Blair is more ideological than Joseph Stalin in the 1920s. Isn't true, by the way. True. And I think this is a really, really important point. What policy is there? If Tony Blair did an intervention, a rare intervention, and he said, we need to bring British Rail into public ownership, here's why, I would really listen. I'd say, what's going on? Okay, he must have a really original argument for that. But you're right. It's just, we need to be pro-business and AI. Tony, you're welcome to come to my nearest high street. There are 8 vape shops over about 250 meters. How does AI stop that being the face of the British high street, the vape shop? How does it help them? These places, the high street, have been nuked by the policy decisions of this country's various governments over the last 25 years, not least failing to regulate big tech, right? Amazon and e-commerce has nuked the British high street. And Tony Blair isn't not just saying that was a mistake or we should have done that, which is the very least, by the way. That's the minimum threshold that British politicians should be doing. He's saying, no, we should do it all over again, this time with AI. We should be wholly enthusiastic about it, no criticism. Our energy strategy should be about AI. Just explain this to me, because here's the thing, Michael. In terms of AI, we can't compete with the US and China because we're not going to have the same size data sets. We don't have a population of 330 million. We don't have a population of 1.3 billion. We're 68 million people. We're never going to have the same kind of data. We can have some successful AI companies. By the way, we do. London is a center of AI excellence. You might not like it, but it is. So again, he's talking in these shibboleths which aren't accurate. Like, Britain definitely punches above its weight for AI. the dude who's, overseeing Google DeepMind is British. Geoffrey Hinton, who's the godfather of AI and machine learning, who's now very critical of it, is a British computer scientist. This is, in many ways, an industry which has an outsized influence regarding Britain. Many of these companies have campuses in London and whatnot.
I mean, the other problem in terms of the sort of radical pragmatism, like he calls it radical centrism, but I think you could also sort of say a radical pragmatism, which I think, Lee Kuan Yew, Deng Xiaoping, people like that had. And, the idea is we do whatever works. We're not particularly bound by ideology. Now, the fear that always comes with that is that people will lose any kind of principle, right? So if you're not driven by an ideology, are you just going to be driven by opportunism? And like Deng and Lee Kuan Yew, both of them were very clear that because they were being flexible with their policy, it was even more important that personally they were very upstanding people, right? They didn't particularly, especially Deng, didn't particularly enrich himself at all. Always had a very humble life. Always was really committed to the party.
There's no mausoleum for Deng Xiaoping. He was cremated.
Whereas Tony Blair, all the suspicions that people might have of someone saying they don't really believe in ideology and just want to do what works, he confirms all their worst suspicions. Yeah. Like for him, what works is so clearly like just code for what's easiest for me to do. And he, other than reforming the Labour Party, which is like, he would say probably is his main achievement, like everything he does is kind of the path of least resistance. Like I'll do whatever America says because America is powerful. I'll do whatever Larry Ellison wants because he's funding my business.
We need the Michael Walker, Tony Blair interview.
Like he's discredited pragmatists.
Tony! No, but like seriously.
By pretending to be pragmatic when actually he's ideological and self-serving.
It's a great question to put to Tony Blair. When was the last time you said, no, you're completely wrong to a powerful rich person?
Yeah.
When was the last time?
Let's look at our final clip of Tony Blair. Don't worry, no more after this. And this is where I think he's sort of most just clearly, obviously at odds with reality.
And with us. And look, my whole belief about the Labour Party, it's had 120 years of history. It's been in power really for about a quarter of that time. And the reason for that is what I always call the birth defect of the Labour Party, when you separated the liberal progressive side from the Labour side. And New Labour was an attempt to fuse those two things back together. And that's why we won successive elections. The trouble is, since then, we've moved away from that. And you do have, I think, this underrepresented centre in British politics. And I think it's basically a supply problem.
So it's a supply problem and a demand problem. There is this massive group of politically homeless people who are just desperate for the politics of Tony Blair. Now it's important to note, actually, Luke Trill was on PM on the BBC today, so he's from More in Common. He said that in their sort of polling and surveys, they have a question, probably not in all of them, but in some of them they've had a question. What previous prime ministers should the government listen to? And number one and number two was Gordon Brown and John Major. And the last was Liz Truss, and the second to last was Tony Blair. So there doesn't seem to be sort of a group of people just grasping for Tony Blair's politics. And that is also borne out by a pollster called Scarlett McGuire. She's a political analyst as well. She polled people on sort of their political positioning last month. She said, centrism is often used to describe voters who think things like this: small state, trust institutions, plus mainstream media, trust government, pro-business, pro-immigration, with controls, loosely pro-globalization. Basically, Tony Blair's politics. The problem is they only make up 5% of the electorate. And then if you zoom in, you've got here what the population is actually sort of divided into: 34% big state populists, 28% new conservatives, progressives 33%, so that's the kind of green-leaning people, and then liberal institutionalists, which is sort of traditional The Economist magazine style centrism, 5%. She says the centre of British politics in 2026 looks like this. So the median voter distrusts politician, wants change, backs deportation, wants large reductions in legal migration, pro-wealth tax, pro-wage ratios, anti-big business, but also dislikes rhetoric that seems too inflammatory, opposes Trump, worries about an unstable world and doesn't want a leader that makes that worse, wants to see solutions over political point scoring. So, I mean, this is not much like Tony Blair, who, by the way, is actually saying we should get closer to Trump. Saying the reason we can't rejoin the EU is because they want to regulate tech and we need to have a deregulated tech sector. But we do have to provide America support in their war on Iran because that relationship is just too important, and so we have to make compromises.
Yeah. And also that has costs, right? So Trident, 200 billion over its life cycle, F-35, 70 billion over its life cycle. But we never talk about those, we just talk about welfare. And by the way, he's talking about welfare, pensions, right? To his credit, he's mentioned the triple lock saying we can't afford it. Was he doing that in 2011? You know, he's criticising a Labour government in real time when it's doing things like getting rid of the two-child benefit gap, which does cost money. Was he criticising the Tories in 2011 when they were introducing the triple lock for pensions, which, by the way, is going to cost a hell of a lot more over the long term, not affordable over the long term? People get angry with me if you have a declining fertility rate, people living longer, more people on the state pension. I'll be one of them. You cannot afford the triple lock. Just go to indexing wages or inflation. That's still better than what we had before 2011. That was the radical demand from the Labour Party until 10 minutes ago. But now apparently the triple lock, which is a Cameron political sort of land grab, is what we should be defending. I don't agree with that. Poorer pensioners should get more. But anyway, I'll say one more thing very quickly.
Go on.
That polling basically showing the sort of Wario to Tony Blair, the anti-Tony Blair. He just doesn't get it. And there's a great quote, and I don't mean to be sort of macabre here. There's a great quote. Scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time. And I don't mean to be horrible here, but ultimately, in 25 years' time, when lots of these guys aren't around anymore, then people start to be honest about their legacy. That's just how politics works. And that's how it'll always work. That's not a unique criticism about them, but I think how destructive their politics has been will be just common sense, within our lifetimes.
The main role of Nigel Farage's various parties in British politics has up to now been to pull the Conservatives to the right. UKIP was never a real contender for government, but by peeling off right-wing voters from the Conservatives, Farage pressured Cameron to offer an EU referendum. The Brexit Party then was also never a real contender for power, but its success in European elections in 2019 led the Tories to dump Theresa May in favour of Boris Johnson and, in the process, commit to a much harder form of Brexit than they otherwise would have pursued. Reform UK is different, though. So this Nigel Farage vehicle is consistently first in national polling. They have a real chance of becoming the largest party at the next general election. They're not just a party which is pulling a party looking to enter government to the right. Now, though, that means for the first time, they're having to contend with outriders to their right. So they're in the place that the Conservatives used to be. Restore Britain is a party founded by expelled Reform MP Rupert Lowe. In polling for the Makerfield by-election, surveys have Labour's Andy Burnham on 43%, Reform on 40%, and Restore on 7%, meaning support for the new right-wing party could be the difference between victory and defeat for Reform. And pressure from Restore appears to already be having an effect on Reform policy. So Restore is dragging Reform to the right, just as Reform, or UKIP, or whoever, dragged the Tories to the right beforehand. Let's take a look at Robert Jenrick. So he's their economics spokesperson on Sky on the weekend.
I wonder if the problem for Reform is that you're going to need to go a bit further than you have suggested up until now. Maybe you need to go further as proposed by your former colleagues in Restore. Here's what they want. Let me show you what they're saying. They're saying that if a legally resident foreign national, and by the way, legally resident is quite important here, foreign national, if they can't do any of these things, speak English, they live in social housing, out they go. Are you attracted to any of these policies?
Well, most of those are Reform policy, have been Reform policy long before this party ever existed.
Is it actually Reform policy to deport someone who is legally resident but lives in social housing?
Well, what we're saying, in some cases, because what we're saying is that we're going to abolish ILR and make a much longer path to British citizenship. And so instead of having this baked-in guarantee to remain in our country...
Current government's going to do that.
It's not abolishing ILR. It's making a somewhat longer path to British citizenship. Under our policy, you'll have to keep applying. If you've got a job, if you meet the criteria, then you can stay in the country and you can work your way to being a British citizen. But let me just finish this.
Hang on, before you go, just to be clear,
then you will have to leave.
Are you saying to me that a foreign person who is legally resident but lives in social housing will be deported under a Reform government just because of that? They live in social housing.
Well, not exclusively because of that.
Well, that's what...
But if
you just said that's what you agreed with.
If they fail to meet our criteria because they're not in work or they're not working in as many hours, not earning enough money, then they won't be able to renew their work visa because ILR won't exist and they'll be asked to leave.
Oh, so you don't agree with
that? That is fair.
You don't agree with all of Restore's
let me finish on
policies?
So the fact that Robert Jenrick didn't express total agreement with Restore was jumped on by far-right accounts on X. So Basil the Great, I mean, it sounds ridiculous. I'm reading out a tweet from Basil the Great, but it's an account with 300,000 followers. And so the account clipped part of that interview and said this: Robert Jenrick admits Reform UK will not deport foreign nationals living in social housing. Trevor Phillips showed him Restore Britain's deportation plans and was clear, quote, "You don't agree with Restore's policies. There are approx 500,000 social homes currently occupied by foreign nationals in the UK. Deport them all and give those homes to British people. Reform are just weak sauce. It's time to restore Britain." Now, you say, why am I showing you this tweet by Basil the Great? Well, it's shared by Elon Musk, which is why it gets 8 million views. He says, restore Britain. And in response to all of this heat on Twitter from very right-wing people, Robert Jenrick's allies in Reform didn't back him up, but rather agreed with his critics. So Zia Youssef is Reform's Home Affairs spokesperson. And he said this: Robert's answer is not Reform policy. As the person responsible for our deportation plan, I want to ensure people know where we stand. If a foreign national lives in social housing at taxpayer expense, they automatically fail our economic test and will be deported. So to clarify Reform's policy here, it's to say if you were born abroad and haven't yet got British citizenship, but you're living in social housing, which I think is I think it might be 7% of people in social housing fall into that category. There isn't going to be indefinite leave to remain. And if you're in social housing, that means you're not rich enough to qualify for a renewed work visa, so you get deported. That's the rather unpleasant policy they're proposing. I suppose the question I wanted to put to you, Aaron, was the more general one, where, obviously I really don't want Reform to win the next general election, but it's possible. And if they do, my hope is that they sort of, in a general election, feel like they have to moderate because sort of the parts of the electorate that I suppose are swing voters between them and Labour perhaps, or them and the Tories, aren't, as crazy as some people on the internet are. But this is, a worrying sign that we might see Reform actually getting pulled as much to the right as they get pulled to the centre.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, people are talking about Elon Musk pushing Restore on X, and I think a big part of Restore's surprisingly high profile. Let's say they keep their deposit in Makerfield, for instance, and they're the difference between Reform winning or not. X is a big part of that, but so is Facebook. Rupert Lowe has 1.2 million followers on Facebook. Just go on his page and see the engagement. It's really, really striking, really astonishing. And I can see the argument. As somebody who's a political animal, I love radical politics on the left, not the right. As somebody who's a political animal, I could look at the arguments made by some people about backing Restore and not Reform in this by-election, because ultimately you want an outrider to keep that party going in one particular direction, and people would make similar arguments on the left. So I totally get it. If you're a radical, that's probably what you want to do. And it seems to be happening. I think by-elections are uniquely difficult for Reform because they're pulling them in all these different directions. And they clearly don't do very well when the spotlight is being shone on one particular candidate. I think in local elections and general elections, it's a different story. It's much easier for them. But clearly, this issue with Restore and them being pulled in various places and the fragmentation of their vote, and with by-elections, with that media spotlight, the media savviness of Rupert Lowe, the extent to which the radical right online is so heavily mediatized, particularly on X, I do think it means they're going to really struggle with by-elections. I really think they're going to really struggle with by-elections. Even if they win a majority of 150 in the next general election, I don't think you'll be able to ascertain that from by-elections.
I mean, what's also kind of worrying here is Zia Youssef feels like he has to respond to Basil the Great on Twitter, right? Which is an anonymous far-right account, which is saying, Reform aren't as far-right as you guys think. They actually don't want to deport enough people. And instead of feeling like he's able to ignore that, Zia Youssef, who wants to be the next Home Secretary, quote tweets it, says, actually, no, my colleague is wrong. Basil the Great, don't worry, is essentially what that's saying.
The future Chancellor of the Exchequer managing this country and its economy, representing this country at the G7, fear not, Basil. I'm gonna embarrass them in front of you because you're right and they're wrong. And one more thing, Michael, this policy. I mean, if you don't want these people living in the social housing, you can agree or disagree with that, then just don't have them living in the social housing. I mean, the idea that you deport them.
It doesn't make any
So let's say this, I mean, again, and I'm not suggesting this is all of these people. Let's say you've been a nurse and you've contributed to this country for 25 years. You're a West Indian heritage and you happen to be living in somewhere in zone 3 in social housing and you happen to not be in work now. And as a result, not just you'd lose the housing, you'd be deported back to Jamaica. I mean, it doesn't feel that kind of policy will survive impact with enforcement. It's a bit like 20 mile per hour limits, right? The minute that 20 mile per hour speed limit goes back to 30 somewhere and a child is hit and dies, you're the bad guy. It's one of those, it sounds good in theory maybe for the audience that it's intended for, but I just don't see how once it's enforced, how it still commands much consent.
This was a story that got lots of China watchers very excited this week. It's from the South China Morning Post, and it reads, China removes hukou hurdle for migrant workers in social insurance shakeup. Now, that might sound like a very technical story, esoteric even, but the hukou system is one of the most important policies enforced by the Chinese Communist Party. It's been in place since the late 1950s and affects hundreds of millions of people. People have been calling to get rid of it for decades, and now it looks finally set to end, potentially. So what is the hukou system? Well, a hukou is a household registration document, which everyone in China has to have. And that's the front of the booklet there. Like a passport or any other ID card, it has your name, your date of birth, a few other identifying details. The key bit, though, is this. The real importance of the hukou and why it's different to other national ID cards is that it defines you based on where you were born within China. So any individual will be recorded as either rural or urban based on where they come from, as well as their city or province of origin. And what's crucial about this is that your classification determines what kind of social benefits like healthcare, schooling, or pensions you are entitled to receive. Since it was introduced in 1958, the hukou system has granted much more generous social rights to Chinese citizens with an urban hukou, as opposed to ones with a rural hukou. So you're massively advantaged, basically, if you get the urban one compared to the rural one. Now, that's led it to be criticised as a form of social apartheid. This is part of a documentary from ABC Australia on the hukou system.
You are not a local citizen. You cannot have access to good quality public school for your children. Your child cannot take national exam. You cannot have access to social housing. It is difficult for you to get full pension coverage as well. I think hukou policy in a nutshell is discriminatory and it's inefficient.
Until recently, rural hukou holders weren't even allowed to move freely outside their hometowns. It was only in 2003 that the Chinese government abolished the policy that allowed local authorities to arrest and evict migrant workers in the cities. But many rural families, like Lin's, still choose to relocate to cities for better opportunities, even though they aren't entitled to the same benefits as their peers.
We were moving houses every year. We moved at least 20 times since we came to Shanghai more than 20 years ago.
So why did China introduce such a discriminatory system? After all, the People's Republic of China was the creation of a peasant revolution. So why did rural people end up as second-class citizens? Well, under Mao, the idea was to keep more people in the countryside to help feed the country's urban population, which he thought would hopefully lead to industrialization. Now, Mao's agricultural policies were completely disastrous, led to the deaths of millions of people. If you had a rural hukou as well, that meant that you couldn't go to urban areas where people got a food ration. In the countryside, you're expected to get it from your own land. However, that was being confiscated. Very bad. In the reform period under Deng Xiaoping, the hukou system played a different role. So for critics on the left, the hukou under Deng was a system which enabled the fast-growing manufacturing industries to better exploit migrant workers from the countryside. The logic is this: if your workers don't have social rights, they are cheaper to employ. So it's a little bit like when people say, businesses like to have precarious immigrant labor because they're easier to exploit. The same argument can be made there. However, those more sympathetic to Deng see the hukou system as a policy, which enabled China to quickly develop its economy without the creation of large-scale slums. So the logic here is fairly simple. If you have a country of over 1 billion people, you might not want everyone to rush into the few leading cities, say Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen. And so the hukou system provided the government with a means to manage urbanization in a more functional way. So you don't get sort of the same slums you got to India or Mexico's major cities. This latter analysis was shared by the World Bank, who in a 2008 report said this: one of China's greatest successes in its rapid urbanization has been that it has managed to contain the process to the extent that there are crowded living conditions but very few slums. This is an important achievement for a developing country, and they credited the hukou system with that achievement. That's the background. Bringing us back to this week's news. What about this system has changed? Well, this is a report from Channel News Asia on the announcement made by the Chinese State Council last week. So they write this. The guidelines called for the complete elimination, so this is the new guidelines from the Chinese government, for the complete elimination of household registration restrictions on migrants' participation in employee social insurance. Their access to basic medical security in their place of residence should be strengthened, the statement added. The guidelines also proposed improving educational guarantees for migrant children, including increasing the proportion of them attending public schools during the compulsory education stage. It says promoting equal access to basic public services for non-registered permanent residents and registered residents is conducive to meeting the people's growing needs for a better life and releasing domestic demand potential, the State Council said. So the article sort of goes on to say that this is sort of hopefully, according to the Chinese government, going to be able to increase consumption in the economy, because if more people have social rights, more access to pensions, to welfare benefits, they're going to have to save a bit less. Or they won't have to save quite as much, and then they can spend money in the economy. Also important to note, I mean, this has been a huge sort of debate on Twitter. Lots of people saying this isn't as black and white as you think. It's not that there was a hukou system until last Friday and now it's gone. This has been loosening for a while. I think lots of the sort of mid-sized cities have loosened it for a long time because they actually have a labor shortage, so they want more people in. But Beijing, Shanghai, all the big cities still have it quite strict because otherwise shed loads of people want to go there. Aaron, lots of people saying this is by far the most important news in the world this month because it affects hundreds of millions of people in a very fundamental way and tells us something significant about Chinese development. What's your take?
Michael, I want your take. You're the Novara China guy. You know, I saw the way when you were talking about Mao and his agricultural policies, you pursed your lips.
Yeah, you think I'm too harsh on Mao.
You were angry, and then you said,
Deng.
but of course the enlightened things you're paying, and you sort of...
then I perk up.
Your shoulders were broader. I could see you breathing out a bit happier, cheeks were rosier. So maybe you talk about it.
Well, I mean, I think this is interesting. I mean, I suppose what I find very interesting is the two ways that this is talked about, right? So Chinese leftists as well, and especially sort of Chinese Trotskyists, their position is that this was a form of internal colonization where you have a hukou system to enable the hyper-exploitation of the rural population. And it's all framed in a very negative light. Sort of Chinese leftists often don't really like Deng Xiaoping because they think that he brought too much capitalism to China and enabled the exploitation of workers. Now, people who are more in favor of reform and opening and more in favor of Deng, they say, as I explained there, that this was necessary for development. And I think partly the way to understand that is that China isn't, I mean, it is a country, but it's also a continent. So when people sort of say, how can this country have internal restrictions on where people can move? And how can you have different rights based on where you were born? It's a bit like saying, in the whole of Europe at the beginning of development, if anyone in Europe could move anywhere and get any kind of benefits, it would be difficult to build up benefits in Britain if anyone could come there and get them immediately. And it's kind of similar to that. I mean, it does seem very harsh because, especially for young people, and I think the darker part of it is that it seems like they wanted working age people to come to the cities to work in the factories or wherever, or the outskirts of cities. But they quite wanted their kids to stay home with their grandparents. And so the kids would go to school in the countryside and get looked after by their grandparents. And then the parents would come to the mid-sized cities and work very long hours without caring responsibilities. And, combine that with the one-child policy, and that seems quite harsh both on the parents and the kids. Even though, I can see why, if you want to have super fast development without slums, then some kind of restrictions on movement are going to be necessary. That's my take.
My take is this, is that lots of people in the West and in Britain will look at the WHO system and go, this is outrageous, it's appalling. We have exactly the same system in some respects. So if you look at, for instance, the NHS, hugely dependent on importing nurses, doctors, all kinds of labour from overseas, skilled labour. And we're basically making other places internalise those costs. So the WHO system is similar in so much as the costs of raising those kids and the costs of looking after those kids once they return back to where they're from when they're elderly, the social reproduction, the social labour, other people can pay for that. But when they're working age and they can make a nice profit for for a nice capitalist in urban China, let's have them. And this is talked about at length by Rosa Luxemburg. In terms of capitalism and exploitation, it's not just the wage-labour relation, where a worker is exploited by a capitalist and some value is skimmed off and that's profit. That's one relation. But she talks about others too. So you have that's a wheel that's turning. Capital is value in motion. What's capital? Money that makes money. It's a wheel that's turning. And then at the same time, you have another wheel that's turning, which is the social reproduction, which allows this other wheel to turn, right? Which is primarily women, but families raising kids and looking after old people. So that wheel, which we never even talk about, allows this bigger wheel to turn. And then, of course, another one is colonialism, where you get cheap resources from places like the DRC or wherever, cheap food, cheap energy, and that allows this wheel to turn as well. So we think of capitalism as wage and labour, capital and labour, boss and worker, but there are these two other circles too, which make that even plausible. One of them is that wheel of social reproduction. So WHO is actually just an overt, explicit admission of how capitalist systems often work. And I think actually, if you look at the NHS, it's just basically the same thing. And actually it's being even more overt now with people like Restore, because they'll probably say, you know what, you can come here as a nurse from Nigeria for 5 years, but you can't claim any benefits at all. If you get sick, you can't get any benefits. You can't get any form of safety net. I imagine at some point they'll probably start saying that these people can't get minimum wage either.
And don't bring your kids.
You're just here to work, just here to help us make profit. And the costs of your training, they can be internalized by the Congolese, the Nigerian taxpayer. And the costs of you being raised can be internalized by your parents. And the costs of looking after you when you're old, well, they can be internalized by your children. So it's outsourcing the costs to other places. So it's a very universal phenomenon. But as you said at the start of the story, this is one of the big global stories of this month, but also of Chinese capitalism over the last 40 years. It's a huge shift. But it's like you say, it's not like it came from nowhere. It's been a transition. But I think to declare it shifting like this is a big moment.
What do you think about the framing, though? I suppose because you're bringing in Rosa Luxemburg, you've got the kind of Chinese leftist sort of idea of this was internal colonization, this was hyper-exploitation, and then you've got the sort of more generous view of Deng as sort of a pragmatist, whereby, it wasn't necessarily like the most fair system, but it was the system that brought China out of poverty. I don't know where you sort of fall.
I mean, you don't need to call it hyper-exploitation. It was exploitative. Capitalism is exploitative. Markets are often exploitative. And I suppose the Dengist argument, and I don't know what Deng said about WHO, but he would have said that
he kept it in place. So.
Yeah, this is a necessary prerequisite to develop the means of production and to unleash the forces of production. And of course, it's happened at the same time that they've eliminated rural poverty. So I think it's part of a broader policy mix, which clearly has left China in a better place today than it was 45 years ago. But it was a very exploitative policy, yeah. But so were the 5-year plans. Loads of bad stuff happened. But I think if you look at certain outcomes, okay, well, the Soviet Union ends up in a better place after that than it does before. I'm not talking about the forced labor camps building, canals or whatnot. I'm talking about steel production and so on. There was hyper-exploitation of workers in certain industries to get production up. And often that was accompanied actually by the workers themselves wanting to be exploited with things like Stakhanovism. And which was a grassroots, bottom-up social movement to contribute to revolutionary progress coming from the workers, which was saying, we'll be more exploited than we'd like to be perhaps for a little while to help develop the means of production. Similar thing going on here.
Mm-hmm. I suppose growth in China was so fast as well that it was, I suppose the Industrial Revolution in Britain we kind of all benefited from it, but there was a generation or two who got really screwed.
A few more than that, right?
In China, it's the people getting screwed are the same people who get to benefit from it 20 or 30 years later.
Well, if you look at the Engels pause, you've got basically between 1790 and the 1860s, 70s, you basically have flatlining or stagnating living standards for working people.
For how many years was that?
Well, at least half a century, I think.
Century.
At least half a century. I mean, people actually said Napoleon Wars, the 1860s, but I think you go back further. That's not the case in China.
Let's wrap up there. Very interesting way to end the show. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.